Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from years and years, titled Communion. So yeah, it's a tagline that I've got on my show Billboard Breakdown that the Canadian charts are always better. Now I'll be discussing that peculiarity somewhere further down the line. I wouldn't always say it's completely true, at least not all the time. As much as I'm a proud Canadian, I'd be lying if I said that a significant chunk of songs or bigger hits up here aren't simply due to our early crossover from the UK, where they tend to debut first and tend to debut a fair bit higher. So why isn't the phrase the UK charts are always better? Well, quite simply, the UK official charts are goddamn weird. Putting aside the fact they don't have a recurring rule, which can mean that songs can return to the charts without warning, sometimes from different decades, the smaller population means that weird oddities can surge in from out of nowhere to huge successes. Sometimes these oddities are kind of awesome, most of the time they're unbelievably annoying, and then there are points where I'm just baffled who in their right mind thought letting this into the mainstream public was a remotely good idea. But the wild disparity of quality means tends to be a little bit wary of hits crossing over from the UK. Sorry UK, a lot of your stuff is amazing, but there is some stuff that's given me a certain amount of pause. Now all that being said, the initial buzz coming from the newest album from UK synthpop electronica trio Years and Years was incredibly positive, even in a year like this one overloaded with synthpop. The group formed in 2010, began releasing singles in 2012 along with some EPs, but it wasn't until King went to #1 in the UK that I started taking some serious notice of them, and I figured might as well check out their debut album Communion, which is an amalgamation of several EPs plus a couple new songs, and plus you guys requested the hell out of it. So, how is it? Well, it's alright. It's decent enough, I guess. I can't help but feel a little bit underwhelmed by it though, thanks to all the hype behind it, but I can definitely understand why Communion is very popular. A very polished, very bass-heavy synth-pop record that focuses on a painfully rough relationship, and our narrator slowly regaining his self-respect and agency coming out of the breakup. But for as much as I can respect the intentions behind this album, the execution pretty much across the board exasperates the hell out of me, either through production missteps, problems in the writing, or a frontman who I really don't find nearly as interesting as I was expected that I should. Yeah, I might as well get this out of the way. Ollie Alexander does very little for me as a frontman of this group. Most because for a good half of this album, if not more, he doesn't bring nearly enough intensity or emotive presence for me to really engage with him. At its worst, he reminds me of a cross between Troye Sivan and Sam Smith with a higher register, and that's not a compliment. And I'm not sure if that vocal tremble is intentional, because it sure as hell undercuts his emotive arc as the album continues. Namely, that I find it hard to buy that he's gaining more strength to move on from this guy when his voice still wavers and quivers like that, even with the support of autotune, which you would think would fix that. At his best, he reminds me a little of the overly slick pop R&B pioneered by 90s boy bands, or maybe Justin Timberlake if I'm being generous. But there's none of the tightness or intensity or visceral punch to really grab my attention, and for an entire album of this, that's a problem. Now granted, he's not helped by the instrumentation and the production, most of which cribs notes from modern, bass and reverb heavy electronica and house that desaturates and muddies the melodies and doesn't really give them the attention that they deserve. And when the most punch you get are from the crescendos or the drums or backing choirs that pop up on songs like Worship or Desire or Gold, the last easily being my favorite track on the album thanks to a great melodic chorus, you've got some problems. And here's the frustrating thing. When you get down to some of the melodies or the beats, it might not all be that original in terms of house or electronica, but they are satisfying. The washed out swell of Shine that gets some gleaming punch of the chorus, the low synth hollowness of Take Shelter or Desire, that great piano balanced on the groove of Ties, to the pretty potent sparkle of King that reminds me especially of Madonna's La Islita Bonita on the verses, but these are solid moments. But I get the feeling the production just gets in its own way, washing out some of the synthesizers or using fragments to try and compose melodies and not really pull it off. Or even songs like Foundation that just feel unfinished to me. In the worst case, you get songs like Eyes Shut, which is a pretty blatant bid for the mainstream as a Sam Smith ripoff, especially in its more opulent, stately production that doesn't match the rest of this album at all. Could have been cut and the album would have been better for it. So okay, with all that being said, did the lyrics save this record? Well, for the first half of this album, they sure as hell don't. With the exception of Shine, which doesn't belong anywhere near the front half of this album, doesn't fit the arc at all, and I'm fairly certain it's about Alexander's current boyfriend and should have been moved until later, thus doesn't even fit with the narrative. The first half of Communion focuses on Ollie Alexander's toxic relationship and the process that it takes to dump and get over this emotionally abusive asshole. And man, does our frontman not make it easy to root for him, as he treats this guy with a slavish attention that seems to almost indicate a dominant, submissive situation. situation. And on ties, the subtext becomes text and the album snaps into much sharper focus. But okay, fine, I can kinda get behind this. Except it's revealed very early on that our narrator knows he's being emotionally exploited outside of safe confines, and it's murky why he's putting up with it. Take Foundation, where he sends the song describing why the relationship should end before throwing all these reasons aside to give this guy another chance he doesn't deserve. Or on Take Shelter, where we get lyrics like, if you want to get used, you get used. And sure, that's definitely true if you want to apply to a strictly BDSM situation in that confines, but most of those relationships are built on a foundation of emotional respect between the dom and the sub that doesn't really exist here. We get hints of wanting more reciprocal love on Worship, the more confrontational moments of Ties where he almost goads him, or the attempt to distance from the emotions on Desire, but across the majority of this album I found it increasingly hard to buy that our narrator was getting over this asshole. Well, it's because he keeps trying to give this jerk more chances to try again, and you get the feeling that Alexander would take him back in a heartbeat if any sort of real reciprocal affection was shown. And that's not even touching on songs like Eyes Shut, where our narrator does a lot to make himself completely unsympathetic, where even he seems to be aware that evading the problems about the lack of emotional equality, it's not gonna fix anything, and trying to pull the same unavailability shtick, it's not gonna work for this guy. And regardless of all of it, behaving like a moody child only exacerbates the situation. In any case, the album does finally show him moving on, and I did like the nice touch that shows how the emotional abuser doesn't know how to react or move on himself when there's nobody to really abuse. But to get to that point, we have to go through a fair chunk of this album listening through a decidedly detailed picture of an unequal relationship. And this is where the framing of this album bothers me and becomes a problem. For most of Communion, Alexander's asking this audience to buy into this earnest passion for the guy. You want to buy that he worships him, and I frankly don't see enough here in the writing to wonder why we, as the audience, should care about this relationship, especially when it's emotionally abusive. And sure, Alexander is aware of this and mentions it frequently, but for a good half of this album, he's too weak-willed to definitively end things, and I can only sympathize for so long. It feels unnecessarily melodramatic, and unfortunately plays it very straight, so it's a bad melodrama at that. And while it did eventually get to the right ending, which I will give it points for, I'm not sure I liked how it got to that ending. So okay, do I recommend Communion by Years and Years? Well, here's the thing overall. I like things on this album. Conceptually, the arc is interesting, the melodic songwriting is good, there are some potent grooves here, and Ollie Alexander, he's got potential. But the album takes too long to get to the drama, clutters itself unnecessarily in the production, and is ultimately held back by a frontman who just doesn't really impress me, and doesn't really seem ready for primetime if I'm being honest. For me, it's a light 6 out of 10, and even that feels generous. Folks, if we're looking for synthpop electronica this year, look at Lower Dens or the Wombats, and Bjork already made the mother of electronic breakup albums at Volnakura this year. I see Communion's appeal, but frankly, doesn't measure up. Sorry. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.